KZSU-FM Stanford. Welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, also doing fellowships at University of Milan's Information Law Center and the University of North Carolina Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Today, I'm very excited to have on one of the most influential writers and thinkers in the technology space over the last 25 years at least, Professor Victor Mayer-Schönberger, who has co-authored along with Urs Gasser the new book, Guardrails, Guiding Human Decisions in the Age of AI. Many Hearsay Culture listeners will be familiar with Victor's work. He wrote the seminal work, Delete, now, I don't know, about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, that established for many people a concept which has now received wisdom within the technology world, which is that nothing really goes away when you put information out there, and what the ramifications are of that, ranging from the impact on privacy to how we think about intellectual property, and more broadly, how we think about information flows. In Guardrails, Guiding Human Decisions in the Age of AI, Urs and Victor take a look at what is a very important, although not often discussed, problem in how we regulate, which is how we regulate. What kinds of decisions do we make, and how do we set up processes that allow for the kinds of outcomes that we want from technology? And so when we think about guardrails in the context of this book, we're thinking about decisional guardrails. What lays out the parameters, the limitations, and the breadth of the scope of decisions that can be made? And this is a very important topic, and one that's not well understood and frankly not well explored. And it's not well explored primarily because when we think about technology, we tend to think about the outputs. What do we want to do with it? How do we want to use it? Where the problems are, where the existential risks are. But in order to get to those kinds of outputs and to understand those outputs, we need to have a process for guiding us there. And so AI, of course, and generative AI brings all of these issues to the fore in a way that, in my opinion, has not come up since the dawn of the commercial internet, which is now about 25 years ago. So we have a new opportunity to revisit, as Urs and Victor do in the book, some of the lessons that we have learned from the last 25 plus years with regard to regulating technology. And so the structure of the book is one that first lays those foundations, ranging from the work that Larry Lessig did with code and concepts around the modalities of how we regulate behavior on the internet, to the modern day and everything from credit scoring to Wikipedia as a decisional process, and of course, all of the risks involving AI. Although the book does not take a normative position on whether AI is good or bad, which of course is a topic du jour on Hearsay Culture and something we've been discussing. The book instead lays out what a decision-making process might look like, what kinds of values and concerns we should have, and then explores some ways that it might play out. And so, despite the authors being both heavily involved in the theory around technology and its use, the book has a very practical orientation, one that as a reader, I wasn't sure if I would see, in the sense that would it be practical or theoretical? And of course it is both, but it is very much practically oriented. So I'm very excited to have on Professor Victor Mayer-Schönberger joining us via Zoom from Austria. I could spend the rest of the show reading off Victor's work. I'll simply say that he is a professor of internet governance and regulation at the University of Oxford, and we are very fortunate to have him on the show March 29th, 2024. Victor, thank you for joining me today on Hearsay Culture.
Thank you, Dave, for having me. I'm a huge fan of your broadcast. I am a huge fan of your work, and I am delighted and deeply honored you have me on.
Wonderful to have you here, Victor. Let's jump right in. And I already mentioned it in the introduction, so I'm going to ask kind of the hard question first, right? People hear process and they say next, right? I don't want to think about how decisions are made. I want to think about what I do with the technology. I want to think about what the risks are. I'm not interested in how, as to use the English phrase, right? Although it has translations elsewhere, how the sausage is made. So let's talk about a little bit about that. How do you sell, how do you explain process as an issue that people concerned about AI should be thinking about?
Well, you know, we humans, we matter because we can leave a little dent in the universe. We do that by acting. And before any action that we take, there is a decision that we take. So we humans, by deciding, by making decisions, we become agents of our own destiny and agents in this world. We become subjects rather than objects. So our decisions, and we take hundreds of them, small ones and big ones, every day. By deciding, we become agents. And so focusing on decision making is actually quite natural. What really is important is that over the last 50 years or so, psychologists and behavioral economists, including the late Daniel Kahneman, who passed away just days ago, focused on the problems of human decision making, that we're often biased. We have cognitive deformations. So we are pretty bad in making decisions, it seems. And therefore, even before Kahneman and Tversky, governments, societies, communities have put in place guardrails, rules, norms that should guide and help people make good decisions, because decisions matter, because after decisions come action. Whether it's deciding between peace and war or deciding who you spend the rest of your life with as your life partner. These are monumental decisions, and deciding well is really important. And so we have focused on putting in place in our communities guardrails to make good decisions. But what is the nature of these guardrails? What are the qualities of these guardrails? And these questions surface very prominently right now because of AI. You know, there's a lot of folks that think that AI could help us make better decisions because we can delegate our decisions to AI. AI is better at decision making than we are. But how do we want AI to make those decisions? What are the guardrails for AI? What are the guardrails? And this is the topic of the book. So it's really not a process book in the sense that it tries to offer process for a substantive question, but it really looks at a phenomenon which is procedural decision-making and offers some thoughts on that.
You know, you mentioned, you know, the late luminary economist, Danny Kahneman, and, you know, it is very much, I think, and I'm going to be a bit pithy about this, a thinking fast and slow kind of dichotomy that, you know, referencing, of course, one of his most famous books, certainly his most famous one in recent years. And I think if I can parallel a bit here, you are very much advocating that we have that dichotomy in mind in terms of not only a guardrail system, but also a thoughtful process. And so we're going to get into this a bit later, but I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more on how Kahneman's thinking and writing in that space has influenced your work here.
Very much so. I mean, his system one and system two thinking, the system one being the sort of more intuitive, quick thinking that is oftentimes almost hardwired in us, remnants of our decision-making to survive in the savannah, which worked very well then, but doesn't really work that well today, and contrast that to what he calls the system two, which is the more thoughtful process. A couple of years ago, some colleagues and I wrote a book called Framers, and Framers kind of takes this perhaps a step further. At least that's what we thought, we still think. And that is, we suggest that even though we humans are pretty bad at times in choosing between two options or three options that we have available because of our biases, whether it's confirmation bias or recency bias or whatever it is. Even though we are pretty bad at that, we have a cognitive superpower as humans that is quite unique. And that is to dream up options, decision options that we were unaware of and that don't exist yet. So we may be bad at choosing among options, but we are pretty good at broadening our option space if we dream with a purpose. And so in that sense, our book Guardrails and Framers are extensions of the thinking of Danny Kahneman, but not just him, Richard Thaler, many others in this field, in this burgeoning field of behavioral economics.
I want to take a kind of 60,000 foot view first on the whole concept of decision making, right? Decision making seems to be, at least in 2024, right, a dying art, at least in terms of anything structured, right? We see, I mean, I'll put aside what's going on in the United States just in Congress alone, right? But even the EU, right, has seen a tremendous amount of tension. Obviously, in recent years, Brexit, right, caused a lot of this re-examination of how the EU operates a decision-making process, right? But individual countries throughout the Western world, the developing world, I mean, the entire decision-making schema of norms and rules and unwritten ways that things are done seem to be under attack in our world. It seems like this is a time where we need guardrails, at least in living memory, now more than ever.
Yes, but only to an extent. And what we write in the book is also that trying to establish a very rigid, very comprehensive set of rules or norms that guide every moment of our lives is actually going too far. We need this flexibility. We need rules that bend a little bit. That's why when we think of guardrails, we suggest it's more like sort of the ropes, the fixed ropes up Mount Everest. You can take them, but you can also climb on your own, but that's at your own risk. And so the guardrails help you get to where you want to go more efficiently, faster, better, quicker. But you can leave them behind at your own peril if you want to. What's really important overall, I think, is that that we understand the moment in history in a way where we're in. Many people who have heard about Kahneman, behavioral economics, cognitive deformations and biases, look at human decision-making and say, rationality doesn't exist. And because rationality doesn't exist, it doesn't help make rational decisions. It doesn't help make sit down and think in a structured way about how to decide. Shoot from the hip, decide from the gut is what's equally good. That's, of course, BS. That's wrong. We know that thinking in a structured way, the system 2 thinking, is actually better than system 1 thinking in many, many instances. And so throwing away rationality doesn't get us into a utopian world where we live longer. It gets us to war, death, and dying. And therefore, what framers tried to do and what guardrails tried to do as well is to suggest ways by which we can accept and embrace the limitations, the cognitive limitations of human thinking, and still advance in a rational fashion.
We're chatting with Professor Victor Mayer-Schönberger, co-author with Urs Gasser of the new book, Guardrails, Guiding Human Decisions in the Age of AI, on Hearsay Culture and KZSU and the Hearsay Culture Network. You know, this show is airing in Silicon Valley, as you know, Victor, where, you know, very much what you just said is anathema, right? You know, ready, fire, aim. You have to break a few eggs. We'll see what works. Let's put it out there and see if people like it. And if they don't like it, try again. How much of what you're describing is anathema to at least the modern innovation process, which I know I'm simplifying greatly, but I'll stick with ready, fire, aim.
Yeah. I think what you describe is an innovation process that's a caricature of what used to be really good innovation. And we see the results. If you look at how innovative Silicon Valley has been over the last couple of years and compared it to 20 years ago, or even to 15 years ago, by a number of indicators, you find that Silicon Valley is less innovative, less creative than it has been. It's actually boring. The innovation moves at an almost glacial pace. Just think about the iPhone, if I may. My iPhone from 10 years ago already could access the internet. I could place calls. I could take photographs and send them around. Yeah, the camera is a little better now. Yeah, it's a little faster. But it's not the radical breakthrough that the iPhone and the smartphones in general were initially 15 years ago, or that social media was 15, 20 years ago. So we really lack those breakthroughs. And that is because just sort of trial and erroring it without learning from those errors is not going to get you further along and does not produce the innovative breakthroughs that Silicon Valley promises but doesn't deliver.
Does AI, of course, write the record, as it were? In other words, AI is clearly right an innovation, although there's debate about how innovative it is. Does AI break that recent scheme as you see it?
Not at all, Dave, not at all. And that's the interesting thing. A lot of people misconceive AI. They think of AI as a way by which we can radically reinvent the world and make it different than it is. Instead, what AI is it ossifies our decisions. Why? Because it's trained from existing data from the past, and it projects this data into the future because it learns from that data. So what it does is it essentially applies the recipes from yesterday to the situation that we face tomorrow. Now, if tomorrow is like yesterday, that's perfect. That's great. Then the recipe from yesterday may work tomorrow. But if tomorrow is different, then we are in a very challenging situation. And so in a way, AI is an efficiency tool. It permits us to tap into existing knowledge at our fingertips, much like Wikipedia, except it's easier to use. But that only works if we have a problem for which a perfect solution is already available. If it isn't, then in fact, we need to think beyond what already exists, and AI really can't do that very well. That requires dreaming with a purpose, and that is something that humans are extremely good at, and machines, generative AI, are pretty bad at.
And I want to get into that a little later. Let's talk a little bit about these decisional guardrails in a little more specificity, because you open the book appropriately by referencing Lessig's work on code, right, and the modalities of behavioral constructs within the internet. And for those that aren't familiar, this is based upon a seminal article, which is now unbelievably about 20, almost 30 years old. It's unbelievable. Called What Cyber Law Might Teach. And what Lessig, who was one of the first guests on Hearsay Culture, and of course the founder of the Center for Internet Society, right, posited is that there are 4 ways that we can regulate the internet. We can regulate it through law. We can regulate it through markets. We can regulate it through social norms. But of course, the biggest insight, or the one that was most cataclysmic, was that architecture is regulation, that code, as Lessig said, is law. And in many ways, at least in my view, right, you're not only updating, right, but more importantly, you're building upon, right, this trenchant work from Lessig 25 years ago, as you describe in the book. Tell us a bit more about those decisional guardrails, big picture, and the kinds of structure that you see around it.
Yeah, I mean, we are standing on the shoulders of the giant Larry Lessig. Larry's been seminal in the movement to better understand technology and its place and how to regulate it for, I'd say, a quarter century, and we're trying to evolve it a tiny bit, if that's possible. The problem with the modality of architecture or technology is that the technologists need to know what the technology should achieve. What is the end game? What's the aim? What's the goal? And oftentimes the technologists don't have a clue, or their clue is wrong. So take smart contracts. Smart contracts are designed to bind two parties of the contract to the promises that they made. And so whatever they want, they are stuck with the smart contract, because the smart contract is executing the promises that they made to each other automatically. And the technologists think that this is good because it lowers enforcement costs and all that. But of course, those that understand the law as a social construct look at it and say, promises are good as long as the promises make sense. If the promises don't make sense, then it's good to break the contract. It's good to break the agreement. It's good to sort of sit down and say, this was yesterday, this was yesterday's agreement, but now we have new information, we need to rethink it. And that's what the law does. So for example, if you break a contract, you are not being thrown in prison necessarily, but rather you just have to pay the other side most of the time the damages that you're breaking the contract created. That's okay if you know the contract doesn't make any sense for you anymore. You break it, you make the other side whole, but you get out of a relationship that is maybe toxic or that it's not good anymore. Contracts and promises and agreements are there to be and exist as long as they make sense. And then the rules just help us break them apart in a rational fashion, rather than forcing us to stick in and stick it out in a relationship we no longer want. Technologists have totally misunderstood that, because they built the smart contract setup as one that binds contractual partners for a very long time. And so the technical modality really requires us to understand the goals and the aims deeply. And a lot of times that's not the case.
You know, Victor, I teach contracts, and so you've baited me now. And I read that part of the book as I did the entire book, with great interest. So let me push a little on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And raise this concern, right? You spend a good amount of time in the book this critiquing smart contracts and the some of the advocates around blockchain technology that builds it, you know, Kevin Warbach and others. And there is, of course, the countervailing viewpoint, which is not only the efficiency aspect, right, but also the understandability. And I want to push on that a little bit, because you know, putting aside the debate around blockchain for the moment, right, one of the arguments that you articulate in the book, right, is that the blockchain allows for understandability and transparency, but also confidence, right? Confidence that a contract is going to be set on certain terms, that it will be enforceable, right? And the mushiness to which you refer in terms of ambiguity around contracts, which of course goes to the very heart of contract law, what do parties intend, right, goes away. Do you see the countervailing value of efficiency, of predictability, of arguable lack of ambiguity, all right, as a countermeasure to the concerns that you raise? Or are they two different frames of, as you point out, what the outcomes should be?
Well, no, the predictability is important because it lowers risk and therefore lowers transaction costs for parties. There's no question about that. But if in order for me to get predictability, I lose any flexibility in a contractual setup, then I might actually be worse off in such a setup, in such a contractual relationship, than without the trust and the sort of efficient mechanism of trust generation around that. And what's also important is that humans, society, we have developed trust surrogates in many different ways, whether it's guarantors, whether it's, or in terms of individuals, fiduciaries, intermediaries like banks, credit cards, and so forth. They all act to create a modicum of predictability. But at the same time, a lot of, in many instances, we retain the fundamental idea that contracts can be broken if necessary. And if you have a smart contract system that is geared towards perfect enforcement, you don't have that freedom anymore. We are not against smart contracts, and Kevin Verbark and I think, agree on that. There is a niche role for smart contracts to be played, but smart contracts is not the fundamental one-all and be-all to solve the contractual problem of trustworthiness, confidence, and efficiency. Quite the contrary. Smart contracts is a niche tool rather than a fundamental progression, a development in the universe of contracts.
Yeah, baked into the arguments that you make in the book is I think a full-throated defense of flexibility, right? And in that sense of uncertainty in light of which we don't know, how AI will develop. But before we take our quick break, I want to mention something else that you brought up in your answer, which is the concept of neutrality around technology, right? Technologists for years, right, have argued that technology is neutral, right? That's of course that's been the position that many internet advocates have taken. The technology has no values. It's how human beings use the technology that makes them good or bad in a normative sense. But you push back against that, and you say out loud in the book, you argue, no, technology is not neutral, and it's tied to this value idea. Ed Felton, who's been on the show before at Princeton, right, has pushed his entire career, I think, is the leading exponent of saying technologists must have an understanding of outputs, as you talk about. But you also say, and I want to ask you about that technology itself is not neutral, that technology itself has baked values into it. Describe that a bit more for my listeners.
Absolutely. And perhaps I am just a disciple of Ed, who I hold in very high regard. Whatever technical tool we use, it has certain values, certain preferences built into it. Now, we can sometimes engineer around them, but we cannot oftentimes totally abandon them or take them away. And so there is value choices in there. You mentioned architecture at the beginning. I lived for a couple of years in Singapore. Singapore deliberately broadened the streets very wide, made very wide streets. And I asked an urban planner one day why, and he said, oh, because it minimizes the chance for demonstrations. If you have small streets, then people can easily flock there and demonstrate, congregate. If you have very wide streets, that's much harder. And of course, if you go to East Germany, East Berlin, you still have those very wide streets there too. That's architecture. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that it expresses certain values. It enables certain behavior and makes other behavior harder to do. Same with smart contracts. Same with how we browse the internet. Same with how we interact through social media. Some interactions work easier and other interactions are harder. If, for example, it's it takes more time for us to delete a photo that we took rather than just keep it in our smartphone, then of course we more often than not stick to the default and amass over time a huge library of thousands and thousands of photographs, most of which we don't really need, but it takes so much time to get rid of them that we don't do that. And so the technology has actually built in guidelines, guardrails that enable some behavior and disable others. So technology is not neutral, even though people can hack technology at times, but technology has built into it a certain bias when it comes to human behavior.
And we've seen, of course, there's been some terrific work over the last, at this point, 5 or 6 years involving bias coded into AI that we'll talk about a little bit more. We're chatting with Professor Victor Mayer-Schönberger, co-author with Urs Gasser of the book Guardrails, Guiding Human Decisions in the Age of AI, that came out earlier in March 2024 on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. You remember KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners to continue its diverse programming. Please email donate@kzsu.stanford.edu if you'd like to make a donation. So Victor, let's turn a little bit and talk a bit about technological solutions to problems, because you hit on a number of topics here that I think all tie in to biases that we have in how decisions should be made. And it's no surprise, as you point out, that many overemphasize technological solutions to technological problems. And in fact, you coined them technical solutionists. So your key question that you have in the book, one of them, what kind of decisions do guardrails facilitate and what decisions should they enable, which is what we've been discussing, suggests that we overemphasize concerns about technology as a solution and get caught up in whether technology should be a solution, and it misses the point we're trying to make. Develop that a bit for us.
Absolutely. Just remember when we talked about the smart contracts, and you said what this is really about is a debate about flexibility, about being able to go back in time and redo some of the decisions that you made, and that means flexibility. Or when we think about the whole debate about fake news, some people, especially technologists, come and say, we can now use AI to filter out all fake news, and then we only have good news left. Now, of course, what they totally forget is that the question of what is fake news and what isn't fake news is a social process. And 1,000 years ago, the statement that Earth is at the center of the universe was not fake news. It was perfectly acceptable to the society then. Today, that has changed. Why? Because we have gotten smarter. We have understood the world a little bit better than what it is. But there are still so many things that we don't know, and where our understanding is evolving. And therefore, thinking that a technological filter could kind of cleanse our human conversation in our society from the bad stuff is not just technical solutionism. It conjures up, in my view, a dystopian worldview where at the end we have only a clean conversation in our society anymore of the 5 or 6 topics that are still allowed. The beauty of humanity is that we are diverse, that we are doing crazy things, that we're not all agreeing. That pushed us forward. Steven Pinker, Michael Tomasello, others have pushed the idea of cultural learning, of learning by watching others try different solutions to the challenges that we face. Oftentimes, they are not better than what we already know, but sometimes they are. And so we learn from each other, and therefore we need to embed that in the technologies, in the guardrails, whether they are technological or societal, that we are using, we need to enable this kind of cultural learning from each other. And that's one of the, what we call design principles of guardrails.
And this gets us to one of the hard-coded issues here, which is, of course, okay, even if you're sold on having guardrails, which most people probably would be, okay, what do those guardrails look like? And so you talk in the book about how values, right, this kind of amorphous concept is important, but it's not enough to say we need to be sure of what the values are. And you discuss things, you identify things like civility, trust, freedom of speech, which I want to come back to, and individual privacy as part of, not in addition to, but part of these broad guardrails. If to articulate the guardrails, therefore, they are to reflect, I suppose, right, to put it in a very simple way, what human beings would define as a happy life, right? What we would define, or is that way too pithy or simplistic a way to summarize it?
Not at all, Dave, not at all. What we articulate in the book is that oftentimes when we are designing guardrails, we are trying to embed a single goal, like trust or free speech or individual privacy. But what we don't do is we don't capture more abstract governance qualities. And these abstract governance qualities include the good life, include what I said, the cultural learning. In the book, in Guardrails, Urs and I are not normative in the sense that we raise the moral finger and remind our readers of certain values that we hold particularly dear. We try to avoid that. What we are pushing as design principles are principles that are that we hope will enable humanity to continue to exist. It's as simple as that. And for humans to have a good life. And so you're absolutely right, Dave, when you say this is a more holistic approach. It doesn't denigrate in any form or fashion individual values that in addition exist, like privacy or trust or so forth, but it really suggests we also need to keep in mind the bigger picture.
So I imagine listeners, when they heard you say, Victor, for humanity to continue to exist, kind of did a double take, right? Victor Mayer-Schönberger is saying that humanity is at risk of ending as a result of. So I want to ask you that question, right? In that stark term, we're at the dawn of an AI age, right? Are those the kinds of risks that you're thinking about when you talk about humanity continuing to exist?
Yes, I am, but I'm not worried about the machine taking over and we humans ending up in a Jurassic Park kind of situation. What I am much more afraid is that we as humanity decide to give up on rationality. We as humanity fully embrace polarization, fully embrace shooting from the hip, fully embrace just following our gut instincts, and therefore then not think about alternative solutions to the conflicts and the challenges that we face, but rather resort to bad old principles from yesteryear in order to solve those challenges, which of course doesn't solve those challenges, and we end up with potential wars. We are in a world that is multipolar, that is much more volatile than it has been for quite some time. And if our decision makers, including us as voters, vote against rationality and in favor of emotions and intuition, then we will not be able to meet the challenges and continue to exist as a species.
We're chatting,
and then we don't deserve it, and we don't deserve it.
Well, this is, as any parent, right, or anyone who is younger than them about who they care, right, have to think or should be thinking in very serious terms about, obviously, as we've done since time immemorial, what world are we leaving our children? And here we are in a great unknown. We're chatting with Victor Mayer-Schönberger on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. So Victor, one of the things you just mentioned in the time we have left, and we have about 15 minutes, which is right now seems tortured, is the idea of the messy decision-making process, including human beings sharing their ideas, right? We're in a time now, which we've seen at other points in history, where people are sharing all kinds of ideas, which, as you point out in the book, may lack any factual basis, may be totally based upon beliefs, and let's be clear, may be hateful, hurtful, and call for genocide, for example.
Yes.
And while you are not, of course, endorsing a particular viewpoint, you are, right, and not endorsing genocide, let's be clear, right? Right. You are endorsing a process that allows for this messiness, this expression to occur in order for better decisions to be made. Now, this might have been received wisdom in earlier times, but that's another concept which seems to be wildly off the table, not just in the United States where I am, but also, right, certainly post-World War II, right? Europe has had a hard time with the concept of speech in a variety of areas, obviously based upon the history of Nazism. Is there space in this current environment, now that we have AI on the table, to revisit some of these messier concepts because there's so much uncertainty on what to do and how to do it, that we need broad-based human messiness, if I can use that phrase, to make better decisions?
I think so. I do think so. The messiness, as you described it, and I think it's an apt phrase, the messiness of human decision making may actually be a suitable strategy for our times. Why? Well, if we live in relatively stable times, then we can resort to the solutions that have already proven to work really well. And we are just using those solutions. And then it makes sense for society, to stick to what's working. Never change a winning team. And that worked really well in times of stability. But what if we are not in stable times anymore? What if we are in times where there are challenges from climate change and global warming to inequalities in our society, to multipolarism in our world, quite existential issues. And I'm not even mentioning a global pandemic or anything like that. As we are facing these rather stark challenges, we might need to think beyond the conventional wisdoms, the conventional solutions that already exist out there, and be open-minded for unorthodox solutions. That doesn't mean that we should embrace them in an untested fashion. Quite the contrary, we need to scrutinize them very carefully. But we need to be open-minded. We need to broaden our option space, because otherwise we might get stuck with 20th century solutions to 21st century challenges. And that would be really dangerous. So I think that we need to be open to discuss all kinds of different options. And then those, including myself, that think that certain options are horrible, we will have to have the better arguments on why these options are bad. And we will have to work hard, fight hard to get those bad options off the table. That's fine. But that is the societal process that we need to go through. And so, unfortunately, I have no good news. The future isn't luxury relaxation. The future is full of more work.
One of my concerns here is, as we turn to what specifics you recommend and the examples you use, right, is that, and I'm curious about your take on the privatization of this technology, the internet as it was developed by educational institutions and the U.S. federal government, right, through the Defense Department, right, had certain values and principles baked into it that are fairly well established, whereas AI has been developed by the private sector, and Sam Altman more or less decided that the world was ready to deal with it. Having said that, the ship has sailed, right? The technology is out there. Is there anything at all that we should take, even from that very recent history, that would be useful in talking about what these guardrails look like specifically, which we're about to do?
Dave, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we talked a lot about infrastructure governance, network governance, domain names, and these kind of things. And then kind of the cavalry moved on. And over the last 10 years, we talked about data governance, who owns the data or who has control, access to it, and all that. And Urs and I think, and that's the fundamental idea of the Guardrails book, that in the next 10 years, we'll talk about decision governance. Who is governing the decision-making process? Who is influencing that? And when we look at OpenAI and Sam Altman, I am less worried about what data goes into the AI system. I'm more worried that a lot of people use ChatGPT and other Gen AI systems to answer their decision questions and almost religiously follow the suggestion that the system spits out, not understanding that this is just a large language model trained on Wikipedia and the Gutenberg digital library and some other things, with all its fallacies and all its biases and deformations. And that's my worry. My worry is less about whether OpenAI is private or public, and far more about how we are using those tools. If I'm using the tool of OpenAI to tell me all the decision options that already exist for a particular challenge, what are my choices? And then I look at them, and that may inspire me to come up with even more choices, better choices. That's great. Then I'm using it to inspire me and inspire my dreaming to come up with something better. If, on the other hand, I'm just sort of blindly following what the machine tells me, then, in fact, I am ossifying the human knowledge because I am not contributing anything additional, anything new, anything novel anymore. There's no experimentation going on anymore. All that happens is that I am repeating the choices that others have already made. And that ossifies cultural learning, human learning, and essentially is deadly for human development.
And yet, of course, we know that the efficiencies, the ease of use, right, how busy people are, right, lack of confidence in their own decision-making processes all make it seem fairly likely that lots of people are going to opt, right, to let ChatGPT make those decisions.
But Dave, if I may interject here, it's understandable because that's how they have been schooled. That's how they have been educated. That's how they have been trained. We have been trained for efficiency. Now, the machine is quite good at efficiency. We are not as good in our efficiency. We are good in going beyond efficiency. We are good for innovation. We are good for dreaming up a world of solutions that don't exist yet. But that, of course, requires different educational systems. It's probably not that relevant anymore to learn 15 different moments in history by heart with year and everything. But it's far more important to learn conceptual frameworks about how to approach a problem and how to solve it. And we're not doing that. So I think we're in for a paradigm shift, a shift change in education and learning and so forth, so that we humans focus on the superpower that we have and use the technological tools for what they are good at.
And Victor, in the remaining time that we have, and there's so much to talk about here, as a law professor, I teach my students, I care about how you make a decision far more than the decision you actually make, which is the same concept. lawyers and law professors listening will be happy to hear that you predict a golden age of regulation coming up. So we can, us lawyers can be very happy about that. But in seriousness, right, we're recording on March 29th, 2024. It seems on a weekly basis now, if not a report coming from either the US government or the EU or governments throughout the globe, really, right? We have the AI Act in the EU. The NTIA here in the United States put out a report that Ellen Goodman put together in terms of the values and structure around AI regulation. Interestingly, while one might suspect that you are dubious based upon your analysis of the role of law in all this, you actually aren't. You actually, in the book, posit that there is a way to regulate, right, in the traditional sense, this technology. And you talk about certain structures that need to be around it, which I want to talk about here. Aside from the flexibility to which we talked about, the three principles for designing guardrails that you articulate roughly in the last third of your book are to empower individuals to make good decisions, to be socially anchored, and to encourage learning, which is what you just talked about. And I want to focus a little bit on the encouraged learning point, because it is so central here, and I think the most amorphous one. You use Wikipedia as one of a few examples in the book of how these three concepts have been used in an effective way to build Wikipedia for what it is. Describe that a bit.
Yeah, Wikipedia is often seen as an online encyclopedia, but actually it's a socio-technical system. Yes, it is a server, and it sits there and provides me with information, but that information is the result of hundreds of thousands of participants around the world contributing to Wikipedia, constantly editing it, curating it, and so forth. They meet at annual conferences. They exchange views. There is conversations online, editing conversations that you can tap into, where you see sometimes battles, editing battles, but really oftentimes thoughtful conversations about how to express certain viewpoints or certain facts, certain parts of knowledge. So Wikipedia really is a socio-technical system. It has a technical component, but it also has a social component. All these people and how they are organized, how they work with each other, they have given themselves rules on how to interact, what to do and what not. And those rules are malleable. They're changing those rules all the time. Why? Because it's the whole idea is emerging, is progressing as we speak. And so it's evolving. Wikipedia is an evolving system. That just shows how powerful learning can be, and how a system can enable learning. You know, as a Wikipedia participant, when you look at editing streams, when you get feedback from other editors, you're learning how to do it better. And the whole community of editors is learning from each other. So there is really a social learning going on, and there is learning even on the rule level as the rules evolve over time as well. That to us is a great example of a system that enables good decisions based on learning.
One other human value, and important construct you mentioned is as a necessary prerequisite to having proper guardrails is self-restraint, which is another, it would seem, right, less valued or dying art, at least in public life. But how does self-restraint, what do you mean by self-restraint, really? And how does self-restraint play a role, which is definitely a theme that runs through your book, right?
Yeah.
Of that kind of control over decision making, but restraint in perhaps, right, giving into your impulses play a role here in the decisional guardrails that you posit.
Self-restraint basically means that you're controlling yourself, and you're not taking yourself too seriously and too importantly. Now, on the level of guardrails, which is what we highlight in particular, it means that whatever guardrail framework you have, whatever laws or social norms or social systems you have in place, or technical systems, however comprehensive they pretend to be, they won't be perfect. And the moment they aim to be perfect, they are losing it. They are going too far. What is really important is for any rule system, for any guardrail setup, to understand that this is just a strong suggestion, but not more than that, and one that can change over time. Think of the fixed rope up Mount Everest. You can unclip from that rope and go on your own if you want to. And the rope does not have total control over you as the climber. It's permissible to unclip. And so in the future, it should continue to be permissible to make decisions that are not necessarily viewed as perfect by the others, or as the right decision to make. Sometimes people make and should have the freedom to make decisions that not everybody is agreeing with. That's part and parcel of the diverse community that we are. And if we take that away, we assume that we have a set of rules already in place that guarantee perfect decision outcomes, when in fact, that's not the case. We know far less today about how to meet the challenges of the future than perhaps we thought 20 years ago.
In closing, very quickly, Victor, and we're chatting with Victor Mayer-Schönberger, co-author with Urs Gasser of Guardrails, Guiding Human Decisions in the Age of AI. Listeners who want to come up with a takeaway from the book involving guardrails might be saying, okay, what can I do right now to make better decisions with ChatGPT that's sitting on my phone, that's on my computer, right? And so what advice or what recommendation in terms of making the decision right now, today, March 29, 2024, would you advise for deciding how to use it?
Absolutely. ChatGPT and Gen AI tools should be used to inspire us to dream, to inspire us to go beyond what they suggest. So use them as tools of inspiration rather than tools of prefabricated decision options. Use them to see what's already out there and then go beyond that, rather than use them to just tick a box, solve a problem very quickly. That's how to preserve humanity.
The book is Guardrails, Guiding Human Decisions in the Age of AI. We're joined today by Professor Victor Mayer-Schönberger, co-author with Urs Gasser. The book is wonderfully timely, incredibly useful, again, covering a topic which is not well theorized or well understood. Also, I'll say for those of you that are thinking about this from a research learning perspective, very well footnoted. I always love books that have footnotes for what they are and what they can be. And so I circled several of myself. But Victor, thank you so much for joining us today on Hearsay Culture. And I look forward to having you back on the show.
Thank you so much, Dave, for having me. Thank you.
You've been listening to Hearsay Culture on KZSU-FM Stanford and the Hearsay Culture Network. I encourage you to go to hearsayculture.com as we relaunch in 2024 with an expanded network of shows, including R&D with D&D with my co-host Denise Howell, Uneven Distribution, which is Denise's show, and Secrets, where I talk about the known unknowns in spaces from trade secrecy onward. Also, you can listen into all of the almost 300 shows from Hearsay Culture going back to 2006 and other content, again, hearsayculture.com. But meanwhile, thank you so much for joining me today on Hearsay Culture. Please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.